They laughed at me. I was just a boy with a bag of toys. That sentence has never left me because it was not only the truth of my childhood, but also the burden I carried for many years. I can still remember the weight of that bag, the way its cheap fabric cut into my shoulder as I walked down crowded streets, calling out in a voice that cracked with both nervousness and hope, "Toys! Wooden cars, marbles, dolls." To some, I was just another poor boy trying to survive. But to me, every toy I carried was a piece of a dream, even if I could not yet understand what that dream would become. I was no businessman, no visionary, no success story. I was simply a child who had been thrust into the merciless marketplace of life before I even knew what life was supposed to mean. The days were long, and the streets were harsh. My hands, too small to hold much else, clutched those toys with a kind of desperate pride. They were simple things, handmade and rough around the edges, but they were all I had to offer. Sometimes I would line them up on a piece of cloth laid out on the sidewalk, arranging them carefully so they looked more precious than they truly were. Wooden tops carved unevenly, dolls stuffed with cotton that leaked at the seams, marbles with tiny imperfections that caught the sunlight. They weren't perfect, but they were mine to sell. Each time I set them out, I prayed someone would stop, even for a moment, to see the value in what I was offering. Yet what I remember more clearly than the rare customer who bought something is the sting of the laughter that followed me everywhere I went. My classmates at school, when they saw me after hours, would mock me openly. "Here comes the toy seller," they would sneer, pulling coins out of their pockets and tossing them onto the ground, as if to see me scramble for them. They had fathers who worked in offices, mothers who wore nice clothes, homes filled with comforts I had only glimpsed from afar. To them, I was not simply poor. I was entertainment, a reminder of what they had that I didn't. The strangers were no kinder. Passers-by would sometimes stop not to buy, but to point. I would hear their comments, whispered loudly enough for me to catch. "Look at that boy, trying to act like a businessman." Others chuckled, as if selling toys was nothing more than a child's game, not realizing that for me it was survival, that every coin I earned went toward food, rent, or my mother's medicine. Their laughter cut deep, not because I wanted their approval, but because it confirmed what I feared the most, that I was invisible, that no one saw me as anything more than a boy with a bag of toys. I often asked myself questions too heavy for my age. Was this what my life would always be? Was I destined to carry those toys forever, always standing outside the glass windows of the real world, watching others live while I remained on the sidelines? I wanted to dream like other children, to imagine futures filled with promise. But dreams feel fragile when your stomach is empty, and your shoes are worn thin from walking miles in search of buyers. At night, lying on the hard mattress in our small room, I would look up at the cracked ceiling and imagine what it might feel like to be free of shame. My father's absence left a void no one could fill, and my mother's tired face reminded me daily that if I gave up, we would have nothing. But even in that pain, there was something inside me that refused to break. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the faint echo of hope, but I carried myself with as much dignity as I could. When someone tossed a coin carelessly, I would not scramble for it, no matter how much I needed it. When classmates jeered, I kept my eyes forward, walking with the weight of my toys as though they were treasures instead of burdens. I told myself that selling toys was not shameful, even if the world tried to convince me otherwise. Work, no matter how small, was still work. Survival, no matter how humiliating, was still survival. I still remember one particular day when the sting of mockery burned so sharply it left me trembling. It was after school, and I had set up my toys near the market square, my heart hopeful that perhaps a kind family might pass by. Instead, a group of older boys spotted me. They were from my school, boys who already wore expensive watches on their wrists and carried themselves with the arrogance of privilege. They circled around me, laughing as they picked up the toys and tossed them between themselves like a cruel game. One of them snapped a wooden car in half and dropped it at my feet, smirking as he said, "Why bother, useless boy? These are just scraps of wood. Nobody wants them. Nobody wants you." Their laughter echoed as they walked away, leaving me to kneel and gather the broken pieces with shaking hands. That night, I held that broken toy in my palms until sleep finally overtook me, my tears soaking into its splintered edges. The pain of those moments carved something into me, a mixture of hurt and hunger, of longing and defiance. I began to reflect deeply on the difference between dreams and reality. Dreams were beautiful, but reality was merciless. Dreams whispered promises of better days, but reality reminded me every morning that I had to sell toys just to keep going. And yet, I couldn't let go of those dreams completely. When I saw other children laughing as they played with the toys I sold, a strange warmth filled my chest. For a brief moment, it didn't matter that I was mocked, that I was invisible, that I was poor. In those fleeting instances, I felt that I had given something, even a little bit of joy. And maybe that meant I wasn't as useless as they called me. That was my first lesson in dignity. It wasn't about wealth or status or the clothes you wore. Dignity was in the way you carried yourself, in the way you refused to let the world's cruelty define you. Every time I stood in the marketplace with my bag of toys, I told myself that there was no shame in honest work. Yes, I was mocked. Yes, I was overlooked. But I was not stealing. I was not begging. I was not surrendering. I was surviving, and that survival gave me a kind of dignity the world could never understand. Still, the scars of those words never faded easily. Even now I can close my eyes and hear them. Useless. Worthless. Nobody. At the time, I believed them. I thought perhaps they were right, that perhaps I would never be anything more than the boy on the street corner. I didn't know then that every insult was carving a path toward something greater, something I could not yet imagine. And then, one afternoon, when the sun was setting low and the streets were emptying, a man stopped in front of me. He didn't laugh. He didn't sneer. He didn't toss coins at my feet. Instead, he looked at me, really looked, as though he saw more than just a boy with toys. He picked up one of the wooden cars, turning it over in his hand, and then he asked me a question in a voice so calm it silenced the noise of the world around me. But one man's words changed how I saw those toys forever. I pressed my face against the glass, dreaming of what I could never afford. There was a store in the heart of the city that might as well have been a palace. Its windows were tall and gleaming, polished so perfectly that they seemed to trap every drop of sunlight and throw it back into the street in dazzling patterns. Behind that glass, the world I longed for unfolded like a dream. Rows upon rows of toys sat on polished shelves, shining with colors so rich they looked alive. Dolls with delicate porcelain faces smiled eternally, their dresses made of silks I had never touched. Trains whistled softly from behind glass cases, their miniature tracks winding through elaborate displays of painted mountains and bridges. Wooden soldiers stood tall, polished boots gleaming, their uniforms painted with precise strokes of red and gold. Every corner of that store was a kingdom, and I was the boy who stood outside its gates, nose pressed against the glass, watching with wide, hungry eyes. I visited that window as often as I could, sometimes after school, sometimes after selling my handful of toys in the market. It became my secret cathedral, a place where my tired body and bruised spirit could rest, if only by imagining what it would feel like to hold something that perfect. The air outside smelled of dust, sweat, and horse carts rattling past, but when I looked through the glass, I could almost smell the polish of the wood, the newness of the dolls, the sweetness of paints freshly dried. I stood there in my patched clothes, shoes worn down to paper-thin soles, and yet for a few minutes I was transported. The children inside always seemed like they belonged to another species entirely. They arrived in carriages or shiny cars, stepping down in clothes so fine I was almost afraid to let my eyes linger on them. Their shoes gleamed as brightly as the toys themselves. Their hair was combed neatly, and they carried themselves with the certainty of those who never wondered where their next meal would come from. Their parents followed, speaking in soft tones, handing over bills without hesitation, watching as their children pointed to whatever caught their eye. And just like that, ownership transferred. The toy passed from shelf to hands, from dream to reality. While I stood rooted to the pavement outside, my fingers pressed so tightly to the glass that they left smudges I quickly wiped away before someone noticed. It wasn't jealousy that burned inside me. It was something more complicated, something deeper. I didn't just want to play with those toys. I wanted to create them. Every curve of a doll's face, every wheel on a miniature car, every button on a toy robot fascinated me. I studied them the way other boys studied textbooks, memorizing the designs, the colors, the movements. In my mind, I dismantled them, piece by piece, and imagined how I would put them back together, perhaps differently, perhaps better. I dreamed of crafting toys not just for the rich children who played in that store, but for children like me, children who had nothing but deserved to hold a dream in their hands, even if only for a while. To me, toys were never just playthings. They were companions in loneliness, teachers of imagination, bridges to worlds beyond cracked walls and empty cupboards. When I sold my rough little wooden tops or cars in the street, I knew they weren't as beautiful as what I saw in that store, but I poured my heart into them anyway. Because toys, I believed, carried something more valuable than paint or polish. They carried the ability to make a child forget hunger, forget sorrow, forget invisibility, if only for a moment. That belief became the fire that kept me going, even when my own stomach twisted in hunger, even when the laughter of others cut me open. But every dream has its shadow, and mine was humiliation. For every moment I spent imagining, there were reminders that I didn't belong. I remember once, as I pressed closer to the glass than usual, trying to catch the details of a magnificent train set whose tiny wheels sparkled like silver, a boy about my age spotted me from inside. His eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat I thought he might smile, might wave, might see me as just another child marveling at something beautiful. Instead, he lifted his toy box high, pressed it against the glass, and smirked. His lips formed the word poor, and then he laughed as he turned away, clutching his prize to his chest like a victory. I flinched, not from his word, I had heard worse, but from the way it was delivered, casually, effortlessly, as though it were a truth carved into the world that could never be changed. Still, I returned to that window again, and again because dreams, even when painful, are better than nothing at all. I told myself that if I studied long enough, if I believed hard enough, one day I might step inside not as a beggar or a thief, but as someone who belonged. I held on to that thought with everything I had, clutching it like a secret treasure no one could steal. I imagined myself behind the counter, arranging toys with care, smiling at children who looked like me, handing them dreams instead of despair. Those fantasies built a world inside me that was brighter than the one outside, and though they didn't feed my body, they fed my soul. But fate is not kind to dreamers, at least not at first. One day I found myself lingering at that window longer than usual, my eyes fixed on a row of tin robots whose arms moved with tiny cranks. The store was busy, children rushing about, laughter ringing out as boxes piled up at the counter. I stood there in my ragged shirt, trousers too short for my legs, watching until I could no longer bear it. And then, without meaning to, without planning it, my feet carried me forward. The door swung open with a polished chime, and I stepped across the threshold for the first time. The air inside was different, warm, perfumed, filled with the scent of fresh paint, polished wood, and expensive fabric. The floorboards creaked softly under my worn shoes, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. For the first time, I was surrounded not by dreams trapped behind glass, but by their reality, close enough to touch. I wanted to breathe it all in, to fill my lungs with proof that such a world existed. But as I took another step, I realized every pair of eyes in the room had turned toward me, and the whispers began almost instantly. One day, I stepped inside and faced humiliation I'll never forget. The cashier's words stung. "If you can't buy, don't touch." I had only wanted to feel the smoothness of the toy's surface, the weight of it in my hand, the way its tiny mechanisms worked when the crank was turned. My fingers had hovered over the shelf for several moments, trembling with hesitation, before I finally reached out and lifted the small tin robot from its place. For one fleeting second, it was as if the dream I had been pressing my face against the glass for all those months had finally materialized in my hand. Its painted eyes gleamed under the store's golden lights. Its little arms moved stiffly, yet purposefully. And in that instant, I imagined myself not as the boy who stood outside, but as the boy who belonged inside. That fantasy shattered as quickly as it had formed. The cashier's voice cut through the warm air like a blade, sharp and dripping with disdain, loud enough for every ear in the store to hear. "If you can't buy, don't touch." Her tone was not a warning whispered gently, not even a quiet reminder, but a declaration, a verdict shouted with the kind of authority that does not simply stop your hand, it stops your heart. My chest tightened, my fingers clamped around the toy before my instinct forced me to set it down, almost as if it had burned me. Silence followed for a brief, painful moment before the whispers and laughter began. A mother nearby pulled her son closer to her side, casting me a look that carried not pity but disgust, as though I had contaminated the shelf by daring to touch what I could not afford. A boy about my age snickered, elbowing his friend and saying, "Did you see that?" He thought he could buy it. The words fell into me like stones, heavy and sharp, and each one left a bruise on my spirit. I wanted to shrink, to disappear, but the more I tried to retreat, the more visible I became. The humiliation was complete when another voice, this one belonging to a father in a fine coat, rose from the other side of the aisle. He chuckled, shaking his head as he said to the cashier, "You were right to stop him. If you let kids like that handle the merchandise, you'll never sell it." His words were not meant for me, but they landed all the same, branding me with a label that I had already heard whispered in schoolyards and streets. Kids like that. The category of the unwanted, the unseen, the ones who had no right to dream. I stood frozen, my body rigid, my throat aching with the pressure of unshed tears. I could feel every pair of eyes in the store on me, piercing through my thin shirt, my patched trousers, my worn shoes. Their glances did not simply strip me of dignity, they erased me altogether. I was not a child with dreams in their eyes. I was an intruder, a shadow that had dared to step into their light. The tin robot still stood on the shelf, motionless and cold, but now it seemed further away than ever, unreachable, untouchable, as though the glass had risen between us once more. My hand twitched at my side, desperate to hold it again, to prove to myself that I was worthy of even the smallest dream. But I did not move. I could not. My body had betrayed me, frozen by the weight of shame. And then the laughter came. Not just whispers, not just smirks, but real laughter, bubbling out of children who pointed at me, ringing from parents who muttered to each other while shaking their heads. Their amusement grew louder as I stood there, a boy who had dared to reach too far, a boy who thought his empty pockets could carry him into a world built on gold. I lowered my head, unable to meet their eyes any longer, staring instead at the scuffed floor beneath me, where my reflection warped and trembled in the polish. My chest burned as though someone had set a fire inside it. The humiliation was not just in the words spoken or the laughter that followed, but in the realization that in their eyes I did not exist as a person. I was not poor in the way a man is poor, but still respected. I was invisible in the way dust is invisible until it dares to settle where it does not belong. Their reactions told me that my presence in that store was an error, an accident that needed to be corrected, and the cashier had done her duty by reminding me of my place. I don't remember how long I stood there before I finally turned and walked out, each step echoing in my ears like the toll of a bell marking a death. My vision blurred with tears I tried desperately to contain, but the cool air outside was too sharp, and the dam broke before I could stop it. Hot streaks rolled down my cheeks as I stumbled away from the shining windows that had once filled me with wonder, but now mocked me with every glint of reflected light. I walked blindly through the streets, my bag of cheap toys thumping against my side, each step heavier than the last. The city blurred around me, the chatter of markets, the clatter of wheels, the calls of street vendors, all faded into a dull roar behind the sound of my own ragged breathing. I ducked into an alleyway at last, away from the eyes of strangers, and let the sobs escape me in heaving waves. My small shoulders shook, my hands pressed against my face, but nothing could stop the sound of their laughter echoing in my mind. That was the moment the world shifted for me. It was not only that I was poor, I could live with poverty. It was not only that I was mocked, I had endured mockery before. It was the realization that I was invisible, that my worth in their eyes was less than the tin robot I had dared to hold. The toy mattered. I did not. That knowledge burrowed deep into me, a cruel truth that wrapped itself around my ribs and squeezed until I could barely breathe. Yet even in that devastation, something stirred. The fire that humiliation lit in me did not extinguish with my tears. It smoldered quietly, hidden beneath layers of pain. But it was there. Every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every laugh at my expense added to the fuel. I did not know how, I did not know when, but some part of me vowed in that alleyway that I would not remain invisible forever. One day, the world would see me. One day, I would not only touch those toys, I would own them. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand, lifted my bag of simple wooden tops and cars, and stepped back onto the street. My heart still ached, my pride still stung, but I carried more than toys now. I carried a fire born of humiliation, of rejection, of being told that I did not belong. And though it burned me in that moment, I knew it would also carry me forward. That humiliation planted a fire I carried into every step of my life. I realized I wasn't selling toys, I was selling stories. That truth did not arrive in a single flash of brilliance, but rather unfolded gradually, like the slow blooming of a flower in soil that had been starved of light for too long. After the humiliation in the toy store, my heart was bruised and my pride felt shattered. Yet I refused to stop. I still walked the streets with my bag of wooden tops, carved, cars, and fragile cotton dolls, though now I carried with me not just goods to be sold, but the quiet determination of a boy who had promised himself he would not remain invisible. At first, I thought selling toys meant merely placing them in front of people and hoping someone would hand me a coin. But I soon realized that those toys carried something far more powerful than painted wood and string. One afternoon, as I stood in the marketplace, surrounded by the cries of vendors selling vegetables, spices, and trinkets, I noticed a little girl tugging at her mother's sleeve while staring at the wooden horse I had set carefully on my cloth. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted in silent wonder, but her mother shook her head impatiently and pulled her along. The girl looked back, longing written across her face, and in that moment I felt something stir within me. It wasn't enough for me to show the toy. I needed to show the magic behind it. The next time I set up my display, I tried something different. Instead of waiting silently, I picked up the wooden horse, held it high, and began to weave a story. I told the children who gathered around that this was no ordinary horse, but a brave steed who had once carried a prince across mountains and rivers to rescue his lost sister. I moved the horse gently across the air, as though galloping, my voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the tale. The children's eyes lit up, their imaginations pulling them into the world I was painting, and when I finally placed the horse back down, more than one small hand reached eagerly toward it. The mother who had first pulled her daughter away now leaned closer, smiling faintly as she pressed a coin into my palm. It was in that instant that I understood. I wasn't simply selling toys. I was selling stories, dreams, and worlds that children could carry home with them. The wooden horse became more than carved wood. It became a symbol of courage, of adventure, of magic waiting to unfold. The spinning top became a magical compass that always found its way back to its owner. The cotton doll became a princess who could keep secrets whispered into her ear. Every toy had a soul, and I was the one who gave it voice. From that day on, my corner of the marketplace was no longer just a cloth spread on the ground. It became a stage. Children began to gather before I even opened my bag, waiting for me to bring my little characters to life. I used my hands, my voice, my expressions to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. And in doing so, I began to learn lessons I didn't even know had names: marketing, persuasion, branding, storytelling. I didn't know these were business instincts, but I knew they worked, and that was enough. The streets themselves became my classroom. I learned to watch people carefully, to notice the way their eyes lingered on certain toys, the way their expressions shifted when I spoke. If a child's eyes lit up at the sight of a spinning top, I knew that was the story to tell. If a boy picked up a wooden car, I made it roar like a racing machine. I learned when to raise my voice above the noise of the market, when to lower it to a whisper that pulled children closer, and when to let silence stretch just long enough to make them ache for the ending of a story. Without realizing it, I was training myself in the art of business, understanding customers, reading their emotions, giving them not only what they wanted, but what they didn't know they needed. And the more I spoke, the more confidence I gained. I stopped hiding behind my poverty, stopped worrying about the smirks of passing strangers. Instead, I leaned into the role of the storyteller, the boy who could turn a piece of wood into a kingdom. The laughter that had once been aimed at me for being poor now sometimes turned into applause at the end of a tale. For the first time in my life, I felt not invisible, but seen. I also learned to adapt. On days when business was slow, I added new twists to my stories. I carved little symbols into the toys, telling children that these marks were ancient runes that gave the toy special powers. On rainy days when fewer people lingered, I huddled beneath awnings and told shorter tales, quick bursts of magic that could still capture a coin before the customer hurried away. Every setback became a lesson, every failure a chance to try again. Looking back now, I realize those moments were the seeds of entrepreneurship being planted inside me. I didn't have formal lessons, I didn't have books or teachers guiding me, but life itself was teaching me in its harsh, unrelenting way. It taught me that value is not in what you sell, but in how you make people feel. It taught me that dignity comes not from the size of your business, but from the pride with which you build it. And it taught me that even a boy mocked as useless could carve a place for himself if he learned to see opportunity where others saw only scraps. Still, the path was never smooth. For every day when children's laughter filled my ears and coins jingled faintly in my pocket, there were nights when hunger gnawed at my stomach because I hadn't sold enough to buy bread. For every moment when I felt powerful telling stories, there were moments when wealthier merchants sneered at me, mocking my little puppet show as they sold their polished goods at prices I could never match. I was learning, yes, but learning does not shield you from hardship. It only sharpens your ability to endure it. And endure I did. I clung to those stories not only because they sold my toys, but because they reminded me that I was more than the world believed. I wasn't simply a poor boy with a bag of trinkets. I was a creator, a dreamer, someone who could take wood, cloth, and paint and transform them into something greater. And though I didn't yet know how, I believed that one day those small beginnings would grow into something far larger than I could imagine. But life has a cruel way of testing conviction. Just when I began to feel steady, just when the marketplace had become a place of belonging instead of shame, something happened that shook me to my core. My newfound success carried with it not only admiration, but also envy. And in the shadows of the marketplace, not everyone celebrated the boy who sold stories with his toys. But success came with a challenge that almost broke me. The toys scattered on the street, trampled under footsteps. The sound of wood cracking against stone is not loud, but when that sound carries the weight of your entire world, it echoes like thunder in your chest. I can still see it vividly. The cloth I had laid out so carefully in the market, the little wooden horses, spinning tops, and cloth dolls that I had carved with aching fingers and painted with trembling patience, all spilling onto the ground as if the earth itself had rejected them. People walked past without hesitation, their shoes crushing the toys beneath them, the wheels of carts rolling over them, the colors I had painted smeared into the dust. For them, it was nothing more than a nuisance on their way to buy spices or bread. For me, it was everything I had. It happened so suddenly that I barely had time to react. One moment, I was telling a story to a group of children about a doll that could grant wishes if you whispered to it at night. And the next moment, a careless man stumbled into my display. His elbow knocked my small bag to the ground. His heavy boot tangled in the edge of my cloth. And with one impatient shove, he cleared my little corner of the market as if it had no right to exist there. My toys tumbled into the mud, and instead of stopping, instead of apologizing, he cursed under his breath about beggars and hurried on, his fine coat brushing against my shoulder as though I were less than air. I scrambled to gather them, my knees sinking into the dirt, my hands trembling as I tried to pick up what was left. But every time I reached for one, another foot came down upon it. A wheel snapped clean off a wooden car, a doll's arm broke at the seam, the delicate paint of a spinning top smeared into nothing beneath the heel of a man's boot. I wanted to shout, to scream, to tell them to stop, but my voice choked in my throat, strangled by the shame rising like bile. To them, I was invisible again, and my toys were nothing more than debris in the way of their important errands. By the time the crowd thinned, the damage was done. I sat there in the dust, staring at the fragments of what had once been my little army of dreams. The wooden horse whose story had once made a girl's eyes light up now lay with its head snapped off. The spinning top that I had painted with swirling colors lay cracked, its design ruined. Even the dolls, fragile but resilient, were soiled, their once bright cloth stained with dirt and boot prints. My heart ached in a way words cannot capture. It wasn't just wood and cloth scattered before me. It was hope itself, trampled and broken in plain sight. That evening, I carried the remnants back home in silence, my bag lighter than ever, yet heavier with despair. My hands hung limp at my sides, my steps dragging through the alleys I had walked so many times before. Children laughed in the distance, their voices sharp reminders of the stories I had once told with pride. Now, those same stories mocked me, because what good were tales of brave horses and magical dolls if they ended in pieces scattered across the mud? When I reached the corner of my small home, I collapsed against the wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the cold ground. My eyes burned, my throat constricted, and for the first time since I had begun this journey, I let go. Tears fell freely, hot and relentless, cutting through the dust on my cheeks as sobs shook my chest. I buried my face in my hands, ashamed not only of the loss of my toys but of my weakness, of the crushing thought that perhaps everyone who laughed at me had been right all along. Maybe I was foolish to believe that a boy like me could turn scraps of wood into something meaningful. Maybe all I had been selling was an illusion that even I no longer believed in. I thought of quitting that night. The idea wrapped itself around me like a dark cloak, whispering of relief, of release from the endless humiliation, from the exhaustion of carving each toy only to see it dismissed or destroyed. I imagined myself walking away from the marketplace, abandoning the cloth, the bag, the tools. Perhaps I could find another kind of work, something quieter, less humiliating. Perhaps invisibility, the curse I had fought against for so long, was safer than trying to be seen. But then, in the stillness of my despair, a memory rose unbidden. I saw my mother, her face worn from years of labor, her hands rough yet gentle as they held mine when I was a child. I remembered her voice, steady even when the world around us crumbled, telling me that life would always test us, and that the only way to fail was to stop trying. "We are not defined by how many times we are knocked down," she once said, "but by how many times we rise again." Those words, long buried under the weight of struggle, came back to me that night with a force that pierced through the fog of my sorrow. Then came my father's voice, just as vivid, reminding me of his belief that dignity is not tied to wealth, but to resilience. He used to say that the world respects those who endure, even if it mocks them first. His words were not grand or poetic, but simple truths forged from his own hardships. "Son, when you keep going, even when the world laughs, you're already winning." I lifted my head from my hands, my tears still fresh, but my chest filled with something steadier than despair. I realized then that the toys scattered on the street were not the end. They were a test. If I quit now, if I surrendered to humiliation, then I would become exactly what the world believed me to be, a poor boy with broken dreams. But if I chose to continue, if I chose to rebuild even from fragments, then perhaps the fire I carried within me would not die. That night, I gathered what little I could salvage. I cleaned the dirt from the dolls, sanded the cracks from the wooden horses, repainted what could be saved. Each brushstroke, each repair was an act of defiance, a declaration that I would not let the careless boots of strangers decide the worth of my dreams. The work was slow, my hands blistered and raw, but as the pieces slowly came together again, so too did my spirit. When I returned to the marketplace the next day, I carried my toys with a different kind of strength. My heart was still heavy, my pride still tender, but I walked with the knowledge that I had survived the moment I thought would break me. I set my cloth on the ground once more, placed the toys carefully upon it, and when the first child stopped to look, I told a story with more passion than I had ever spoken before. My voice carried not only the tale of a toy, but the truth of a boy who refused to give up. I knew then that resilience itself was a kind of story, one that children would feel even if they didn't understand it. My toys had survived, and so had I, and in that survival there was dignity. And then, an unexpected customer changed my life. He stopped, picked up a toy, and asked me a question that froze me. The marketplace had become so familiar to me that I could have walked through it blindfolded and still known every sound, every smell, every uneven stone under my feet. The cries of the fruit sellers with their baskets of oranges, the clatter of metal from the blacksmith's stall, the laughter of children chasing one another through narrow aisles. It was all part of a rhythm I had grown used to. the background music of my struggle. I sat in my usual corner, my cloth spread carefully, my repaired toys lined in rows as though they were soldiers ready for battle. My voice carried through the noise as I told stories of brave wooden horses and magical spinning tops, stories that had become my shield against the pitying or mocking eyes of passers-by. On that day, my spirit was steady, though still scarred from the night I almost gave up. Each sale felt like a small victory, each coin a reminder that resilience mattered. I did not expect anything more than enough to buy bread for the evening and wood for tomorrow's carving. I certainly did not expect a stranger who would change the course of my life. He came from the direction of the Grand Avenue, his footsteps slower than the rush of the crowd, as though he had time to spare in a world where most people hurried past. His clothes marked him immediately as someone of wealth, a dark tailored coat that fell just above polished shoes, a hat tilted slightly over his brow, and a walking stick that clicked softly against the cobblestones. His presence seemed to part the air around him. People glanced. Some even stepped aside, though he carried himself not with arrogance, but with quiet authority. I noticed him only when he stopped before my cloth. His shadow fell across my toys, and I looked up, half expecting the familiar smirk of someone about to mock my small display. But instead, I found eyes that studied, not sneered. He crouched slightly, his expensive coat brushing the dust of the market, and reached down to pick up a small spinning top I had painted with swirls of red and gold. He turned it gently in his hand, watching the way the light caught its patterns, then looked directly at me. "How did you think of this design?" he asked. The question stunned me. People had asked me prices. They had asked if the toys were sturdy. They had even asked if I would sell them cheaper. But no one had ever asked me how. No one had cared to know what thought, what vision, what heart went into the toys I carved. For a moment, words deserted me. I stared at him, my mouth half open, before I finally stammered, I painted it to look like fire. So when it spins, it looks alive." He placed the top on the ground and flicked it with his hand. The little toy spun smoothly, the colors blending together until they resembled a flickering flame, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Alive," he repeated softly, almost to himself. Then his eyes returned to mine. "You sell these toys every day?" I nodded quickly, still unsure of what to say, my heart pounding with a nervousness I didn't understand. "And when you sell them," he continued, "do you sell the toy, or do you sell the story you tell with it?" That question struck me deeper than I could have imagined. It was as though he had seen directly into the truth I had discovered, the truth I had guarded like a fragile secret. I was not selling toys, I was selling stories, dreams, hope in the form of wood and paint. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and whispered, "The story. Always the story." For the first time in my life, someone did not laugh at those words. He did not look at me as though I was foolish or childish. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, his eyes steady and thoughtful, as though he was weighing more than just the spinning top in his hand. "Good," he said at last, "because stories last longer than toys. And someone who understands that understands more than he realizes." My chest tightened with something I hadn't felt in years. The rare, overwhelming sensation of being seen. Not as a poor boy with dirt-streaked hands, not as the child mocked for dreaming too much, but as someone with vision. In that crowded marketplace, surrounded by noise and chaos, it was as though the world had narrowed to just the two of us. A wealthy stranger with kind yet piercing eyes, and a boy who had never been acknowledged for more than the dirt on his shoes. He asked me questions that no one else had ever asked. How long did it take me to carve each toy? Where did I learn to paint? Why did I tell the stories the way I did? I answered awkwardly at first, fumbling over words, but as the conversation stretched on, I found myself speaking more freely. I told him about my father's lessons on dignity, My mother's words about resilience, the nights I spent under a flickering lamp sanding wood until my hands ached. I told him how I created stories because I believed toys were more than objects, that they carried magic when paired with imagination. He listened intently, never interrupting, never mocking, his head tilting slightly as though each answer confirmed something he already suspected. His silence was not the silence of dismissal, but of attention, and for me, that was more valuable than all the coins I had ever earned. Finally, he set the spinning top back onto my cloth and rose to his full height. The marketplace seemed to hush for a moment as he reached into the inner pocket of his coat. My breath caught, unsure of what he was doing, until he pulled out a small card. He held it between his fingers, the edges catching the sunlight, and extended it toward me. "I don't buy toys today," he said gently, "but I buy vision. And you, young man, have vision." His voice carried a certainty that made my chest ache, a conviction that wrapped around me like armor against all the years of mockery. "Come see me when you are ready. There is something more you can do with this gift than sell on the street." I reached out with trembling fingers, taking the card as though it were made of glass. The paper was thick, the letters embossed in gold, a name and an address printed neatly across its surface. My eyes scanned it quickly, but my mind was too overwhelmed to comprehend what it meant. All I knew was that in the space of a few moments, a stranger had shifted something inside me that had been buried for too long. He had looked at me and seen not poverty, not humiliation, but potential. He tipped his hat slightly, turned, and walked back into the crowd, his figure disappearing among the stalls and voices as quickly as he had appeared. I stood frozen, the card clutched tightly in my hand, my heart racing with both fear and excitement. I had no idea then what his words meant, no idea where that card would lead me, but deep down I understood one thing with absolute clarity. My life had just shifted forever. He handed me his card, and I didn't know then, but my life had shifted forever. From street corner to office, my hands shook as I signed the papers. The day I walked into that office, I felt like a boy trespassing in a world not meant for him. My hands were rough with splinters from carving wood. My clothes smelled faintly of varnish and paint. And yet there I was, standing in a room lined with leather chairs, heavy curtains, and polished wooden desks that gleamed under the golden glow of lamps. The stranger from the marketplace sat behind one of those desks, his presence no less commanding than the first day I had met him, though this time he was not a passerby. He was the man offering me an opportunity I had never dared to dream of. He leaned forward, his fingers folded neatly, his gaze steady as he explained what he wanted from me. It was simple, at least in his words. He owned a small chain of stores, and he believed my toys could sell there. He would give me a chance to supply a modest number, no more than a few dozen pieces at first, just enough to test if people would buy them beyond the marketplace. "This is not charity," he said firmly, his tone sharp with clarity. "I am not giving you money. I am giving you a stage. You must prove whether you belong on it." When he slid the papers across the desk, my hands trembled as I reached for the pen. The words on the page blurred together, but I understood the essence. I was agreeing to deliver toys in exchange for payment upon successful sale. It was a contract, the first piece of official paper that had ever carried my name in ink, and as I pressed the pen down, I felt the enormity of the moment crush and lift me at the same time. A boy who once crouched in the dirt with broken toys was now entering an agreement with a man who believed in his vision. Leaving his office that day, the card still tucked into my pocket, I felt like the city looked different. The same streets that had once laughed at me now seemed like paths leading to something greater. Yet beneath the surge of pride was a tidal wave of fear. I had carved toys for children in the marketplace, telling stories to capture their hearts. But this was different. This was business, numbers, deadlines, expectations. If I failed, I would not only lose the chance he had given me, I would confirm every cruel voice that had ever called me foolish. I spent nights hunched over scraps of wood, my lamp flickering low, the air thick with the smell of shavings and paint. My hands blistered as I carved, my eyes stung from exhaustion, but I worked with a ferocity that came from more than ambition. It came from desperation. Every doll I stitched, every horse I painted, every top I polished carried not just craftsmanship, but the weight of my hope. I was no longer carving just for coins. I was carving for dignity, for the chance to prove that I was more than the shadow the world had forced me to become. When I finally delivered the box of toys to his store, I held my breath as they placed them on the shelves. At first, nothing happened. People walked past, glancing but not stopping, their attention swallowed by shinier, more expensive toys that seemed to mock my simple creations. My heart sank, and for days I hovered near the store, pretending to browse as I watched, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. And then it happened. A little boy tugged at his mother's hand, pointing at one of the spinning tops painted in bright flames. She sighed, clearly weary from shopping, but gave in, buying it for him with little ceremony. I followed them with my eyes as they left the store, and when the boy dropped the top to the ground and spun it, his face lit up. His laughter rang out in the street, pure and bright, and in that sound, I felt something shift inside me. That single moment, a child smiling because of something I had made, became the first ember of hope that perhaps I belonged in this world after all. The toys began to sell slowly at first, then steadily. One by one, customers carried them out of the store, and the shopkeeper began to look at me differently, not as a boy with dirt-streaked hands, but as someone worth doing business with. When I received my first payment, real notes folded into an envelope, my hands shook as I opened it. It was more money than I had ever held at once, not enough to make me rich, but enough to lift the crushing weight of hunger and despair. But the money was not the true reward. The true reward was confidence. For the first time, I realized that my dreams were not just fantasies. They could live, breathe, and exist in the real world. I learned quickly that running a business required more than passion. I had to manage time, calculate costs, ensure quality, and deliver on promises. I had to wake earlier, work longer, and push myself past the limits of exhaustion. I stumbled often, cutting wood unevenly, painting designs that smudged, stitching dolls that came apart. But each mistake became a lesson. Slowly, I was learning not just how to make toys, but how to build something greater. And with each step forward, I felt the weight of those who once mocked me lift slightly from my shoulders. I no longer needed their approval, because I had found something far more valuable: belief. Not only the belief of the stranger who had given me the chance, but belief in myself. Every toy sold was proof that I was not useless, that my hands, though rough and calloused, could shape more than scraps of wood. They could shape my future. Yet success is a strange companion. It warms you with pride, but it also casts shadows you do not expect. The more my toys sold, the more whispers began to circle in the marketplace. Some merchants looked at me with narrowed eyes, muttering that a street boy had no place in the shops of the wealthy. Competitors scoffed, saying my toys were childish fancies that would never last. Even some of the children who once bought from me in the street now looked with envy, their laughter tinged with the bitterness of those who resented my climb. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in work, but unease lingered in the corners of my mind. Success had given me a foothold, but it had also made me visible in ways I had never been before. And visibility, I would soon learn, attracts more than admiration. It attracts enemies. But success brought enemies I wasn't ready for. Trust turned into the sharpest knife in my back. If my first deal had felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, Then the months that followed taught me how quickly shadows can creep back in. Success, even in its small beginnings, gave me courage, but it also made me naive. I believed that if someone shook my hand firmly and smiled at me while looking into my eyes, it meant their heart matched their words. I thought trust was as simple as loyalty, that business could be built on promises as easily as stories. I was wrong, painfully wrong, and the lesson I learned came not from strangers mocking me, but from people I had allowed close, people I had believed were on my side. As demand for my toys grew, the stranger who had first believed in me advised me to take on help, to bring others into the fold so I could keep up with orders. The idea thrilled me. The thought of no longer carving alone, of having a small team, of watching my creations spread further than my 2 hands could carry them. So I partnered with 2 men who had approached me in the marketplace, men with smooth voices and polished manners who said they admired my vision. They spoke of efficiency, of networks, of connections I could never dream of reaching alone. They told me that with their help, I could turn my little workshop into something that would supply not just a store, but an entire district. Their words were honey to a boy who still carried the scars of mockery. I wanted to believe them, and so I did. We signed agreements that I barely understood, contracts filled with words that seemed too heavy for me to carry, but I told myself it didn't matter. They would handle the complexities. I would focus on creating, and together we would rise. For a brief time, it felt as though the world was aligning in my favor. Orders increased, coins flowed more freely than ever, and I walked with my head higher, feeling as though I was finally shaking free of the weight of poverty. But dreams built on blind trust are fragile, and mine shattered before I realized how precarious they were. The first signs were subtle. Payments delayed, excuses about costs, explanations that seemed too complicated for me to follow. When I asked why the profits were not what we had expected, they assured me that expansion always came with sacrifices, that the reward would be greater in the end. I wanted so desperately to believe them that I silenced the doubts gnawing in the back of my mind. Each time they presented me with papers to sign, I did so quickly, my hands eager to return to wood and paint rather than wrestle with numbers I barely understood. Then one day, I arrived at the workshop to find it empty. The shelves bare, the crates gone, the accounts drained. The men I had called partners had vanished, leaving nothing but debts in my name and whispers in the marketplace that I had been foolish enough to trust wolves dressed as friends. I remember sitting alone on the cold floor, staring at the scattered wood shavings, my chest hollow. The silence was unbearable, heavier than laughter, sharper than mockery. I thought of the nights I had spent bent over the lamp, carving until my fingers bled, believing that I was building something that would last. And now, in a single cruel twist, it was gone, stolen by the very hands I had trusted to help me. The financial loss was devastating, but it was the emotional betrayal that cut deepest. I had not just lost money, I had lost faith. Faith in myself for being so blind, faith in others for proving that trust could be nothing more than a weapon. I walked through the streets like a ghost, the same alleys where I had once carried my bag of toys now echoing with the sound of my failure. People whispered when I passed, some with pity, others with the cruel satisfaction of being proven right. The boy who dreamed too much had flown too high, and now he had crashed exactly where they had always predicted he would. In those weeks, loneliness wrapped around me tighter than hunger ever had. I had no one to turn to, no partners, no friends, and even the stranger who had given me my first chance was distant, waiting perhaps to see if I would crumble or rise again. My family supported me quietly, their eyes filled with worry, but I could see the exhaustion in their faces, the unspoken fear that maybe I had dragged us back to the edge of survival for nothing. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying every handshake, every word, every moment when I could have seen the truth, but chose not to. Rage simmered in my chest, not only at them, but at myself, for being so desperate to trust that I ignored the signs. I thought of the man who had once called me useless, and for a terrifying moment, I wondered if perhaps he had been right. Maybe I was not meant for this world of contracts and numbers. Maybe I was nothing more than a boy with toys who had stumbled too far into a game he could not win. But despair is a dangerous companion, and if you let it stay too long, it convinces you to stop walking. One night, as I sat at my small table with nothing but a candle and a few broken scraps of wood, I remembered my mother's words about resilience, words that had lifted me when I thought I was finished before. "We are not defined by the fall," she had said. "We are defined by whether we rise." I realized then that the betrayal, as cruel as it was, had taught me something no success could have. I had learned that trust in business must be earned, not given freely. I had learned that contracts must be understood, not blindly signed. I had learned that vision is powerful, but without vigilance, it can be stolen. The lesson was bitter, but it was mine, carved into my heart more deeply than any toy I had ever shaped. So I rose again. Slowly, painfully but deliberately. I began once more with scraps, repairing what little I had, carving new pieces, telling stories with the same fire I had carried as a boy on the street corner. People still doubted me, but I no longer sought their approval. I no longer handed trust to anyone who smiled. If I was to rebuild, it would be on foundations so strong that no betrayal could shake them again. I was back at the bottom, but I refused to stay there. Failure wasn't the end. It was the blueprint. The day I realized that betrayal had not broken me, but instead taught me, something inside me shifted forever. For weeks after my so-called partners disappeared, I walked the streets like a shadow, ashamed of my foolishness, burdened by debts that weren't even mine, and crushed by the whispers of people who said they always knew a boy like me would fail. Yet in that darkness, I discovered something more powerful than hope. I discovered resolve. Failure was not the end of my story. It was the map showing me exactly where I had gone wrong and how I could carve a better path. Sitting alone at my workbench with nothing more than a cracked lamp and a few scraps of discarded wood, I told myself that if I was going to rebuild, it would not be by copying what I had already done. I would not make toys the way others expected me to. I would not sell them as though they were merely distractions for children. If I was to rise again, I would make toys that carried pieces of myself. Toys that told stories, toys that felt alive. Toys that children would not simply play with, but remember. The first step of my comeback was humbler than anyone could have imagined. I scavenged wood from old furniture tossed out in alleyways. I collected paints left half-used by carpenters, and I stitched fabric from worn-out clothes donated by neighbors. Every toy that emerged from my hands was born from scraps. Yet I treated them as treasures. I poured into them not just skill, but imagination, shaping them into figures that carried meaning. A soldier carved with a scar across his cheek to remind children that courage wasn't about looking perfect. A doll with mismatched buttons for eyes meant to show that beauty came from uniqueness, not symmetry. A spinning top painted in the colors of the night sky, designed to remind every child that even darkness could sparkle with light. At first, no one cared. I stood again in the corners of the marketplace, my toys laid out carefully, my voice telling stories as I always had. People passed by, some pitying me, others still smirking at my fall. I could feel their unspoken words. Here he is again, trying to sell dreams with scraps. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It started with one child, a girl no older than 6, her small hand clutching a coin as she stared at the doll with mismatched eyes. Her mother tried to pull her away, telling her she could buy something brighter, shinier, from the big toy shop down the road. But the girl insisted. When she finally placed that coin in my hand, her face lit up as though she had just been given a treasure. I watched her clutch the doll to her chest as she walked away. And in that moment, I realized that my toys were no longer mere playthings. They were companions. They were pieces of identity. They were fragments of dignity in wood and cloth. Word spread slowly, not through advertisements or posters, but through whispers. Parents began to notice that their children cherished my toys in ways they did not cherish the store-bought ones. They slept with them, carried them to school, invented stories around them that grew into small worlds of wonder. My toys, imperfect as they were, became personal. They belonged not just to the marketplace, but to the hearts of those who owned them. As weeks turned into months, I expanded carefully. I saved every coin, reinvested every profit, and avoided the traps I had once fallen into. No more blind trust, no more rushing into partnerships, no more ignoring the fine print of contracts. I became my own accountant, my own supplier, my own manager. It was exhausting, nearly unbearable at times, but it meant that every decision was mine, every risk calculated, every lesson learned applied with precision. Slowly, stalls turned into a workshop again. A workshop turned into a rented space where I hired 2 young apprentices, not slick-tongued men with smooth promises, but boys from the streets who, like me, had been mocked for being poor and overlooked. I taught them not just how to carve wood or paint patterns, but how to believe in the meaning behind the toys. I told them the same thing the stranger once told me. You're not selling wood. You're selling a story. The difference this time was remarkable. Customers no longer looked at me as the desperate boy clinging to scraps. They looked at me as someone who had risen from nothing with dignity. They admired my persistence, and slowly, even the larger stores began to take notice. One by one, they approached me, asking if they could stock my toys. At first, I hesitated, memories of betrayal burning like old scars. But I remembered my plan: to rebuild with wisdom. This time I brought contracts to lawyers. I read every line. I signed nothing without understanding. And with each deal, my toys spread further, from stalls to shops, from shops to small chains, from small chains to distant towns. Children carried my creations into homes I had never seen, their laughter echoing in places I could only imagine. My designs grew bolder. I experimented with puzzles that taught lessons of patience, trains with detachable carriages that told stories of journeys, dolls with changeable outfits that reflected different dreams. I realized that toys were not just entertainment. They were education, companionship, memory. And I wanted to build a world where every child, rich or poor, could feel that connection. Yet behind every success was the memory of failure, a shadow that reminded me to remain cautious. I still heard whispers in the marketplace, but they no longer stung. Some were voices of envy, others of disbelief, but none of them could erase the truth. I was rising again, one toy, one story, one child at a time. Looking back, I saw the irony clearly. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had also saved me. It forced me to shed naivety, to abandon blind trust, to learn the language of contracts and numbers I had once ignored. It stripped me of illusions, but left me with tools. It had not ended my story. It had given me the blueprint to write the next chapter with strength and clarity. And so I worked, day and night, with my apprentices by my side, with stories flowing from my lips as naturally as breath, with hope stitched into every toy we created. There were nights when exhaustion nearly crushed me, when the weight of responsibility threatened to bend my back. But each time I faltered, I remembered the little girl clutching the mismatched doll, and I reminded myself why I had begun. The comeback was not easy, but it was real. And just when I thought I had finally carved a stable path, just when I believed that nothing could shake me again, Fate whispered otherwise. And then came the news that shook me to my core. The toy company was going bankrupt. I walked into the same office where they once rejected me, this time with a contract. The news of the toy company's bankruptcy hit me like thunder rolling through clear skies. At first, I did not believe it. This was the same company whose store window I had once pressed my face against as a child. The same company whose cashier had humiliated me with words so sharp they had burned into my memory forever. If you can't buy, don't touch. To hear that this empire, with its glowing glass stores and endless shelves of toys I could never afford, was collapsing. It felt like irony so thick that even fate itself must have been laughing. Yet as the shock subsided, another feeling rose within me. Not laughter, not scorn, but something far deeper. Opportunity. For years I had built my own small empire from scraps, one carved toy and one whispered story at a time. I had been betrayed, humiliated, broken, but never destroyed. Now, standing taller than I ever thought possible, I saw before me the chance to do something that once seemed impossible. To walk back into the company that had once made me feel invisible, not as a poor boy begging to touch what he could not afford, but as a buyer with the power to save it. The first time I stepped into their headquarters again, I felt the weight of memory pressing against me. The lobby still smelled faintly of polished wood and plastic packaging. The walls lined with framed posters of smiling children holding toys that had once seemed untouchable. But the shine was gone. Dust clung to corners. Sales charts hung tilted on walls with numbers scribbled in red. And the workers who passed by no longer carried pride in their steps, but exhaustion in their faces. This was not the empire I had once envied. This was a sinking ship, leaking through every seam, its sailors scrambling without direction. I was led to a conference room where the remaining executives sat, their suits pressed but their eyes hollow. They looked at me without recognition, at least not at first. And then I saw the flicker. One of them leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, as though trying to recall a memory buried deep in the dust of years. I knew what he was remembering. He was remembering the boy who had once been shooed away from their store window, the boy who had been humiliated at the counter. And now here I was, sitting across from them, papers tucked beneath my arm, not as a beggar, but as a buyer. The irony was heavy in the air, but I carried myself with calm dignity. I told them plainly I wanted to buy their company. The words seemed to stun them, and for a moment, silence hung like a curtain. Then came the whispers, the smirks, the thinly veiled disbelief. "You?" one of them muttered. "A toy seller?" But I didn't flinch. I laid out the documents I had prepared, contracts drafted with care, terms written with the kind of precision I had once ignored to my own destruction. I showed them the numbers, how my small but thriving toy business had grown, how customers now connected more to stories than to mass-produced plastic, how my unique designs had carved out a market that was only growing while theirs collapsed. Their eyes shifted as they flipped through the papers. Disbelief turned to discomfort, discomfort to reluctant recognition. They had no choice but to acknowledge what the numbers shouted. I was not a boy with a bag of toys anymore. I was a businessman who had learned from betrayal, who had built something resilient, who had come prepared with strategy as sharp as steel. Signing the agreement was surreal. My hand trembled as I pressed the pen to paper. But not from fear, from the weight of irony. I thought of the younger me, the boy standing outside their store window with empty pockets. And I wanted to reach back through time and whisper to him, "One day, you won't just touch these toys. You will own them." When the deal was finalized, I walked through the building not as a visitor, but as its owner. Employees looked at me with wide eyes, some whispering, some staring openly, and I could almost hear the echo of my past, the cashier's sharp words, the laughter of children who had seen me shamed. But this time, I did not feel small. This time, I felt the weight of victory. Not the shallow victory of revenge, but the deeper one of transformation. I was no longer the boy they had humiliated. I was the man who had turned that humiliation into fire, who had used failure as blueprint, who had taken betrayal and reshaped it into resilience. Still, amidst the triumph, my heart remained heavy with humility. I did not want to destroy the company. I wanted to rebuild it. I wanted to infuse it with the values I had carried since my first toy sold: dignity, storytelling, imagination, and respect. This company would no longer be about mass-produced plastic to be forgotten after a week. It would be about toys that mattered, toys that lived in memory, toys that taught children not only to play, but to dream. The transition from seller to owner was overwhelming. There were endless meetings, audits that revealed the depth of the company's rot, negotiations with suppliers who no longer trusted promises. At night, I sat in the founder's office, the heavy desk before me covered in stacks of files, my head pounding with the burden of decisions I had never imagined having to make. Yet even in the exhaustion, there was purpose. I was not a janitor in someone else's empire anymore. I was the builder of my own. And yet, destiny had one more twist waiting for me, hidden in the very heart of that office. It was late one evening, the building quiet, the halls dim with only the glow of emergency lights, when I noticed a drawer in the founder's desk that had remained locked. The key had long been forgotten, but determination made me pry it open. Inside was an envelope, yellowed with age, its seal unbroken. On the front, in careful handwriting, was a single phrase: "For the one who saves us." My chest tightened as I held it in my hands, the paper brittle yet impossibly heavy with meaning. No one else had ever seen it, no one had ever known it was here. And as I slid my finger beneath the seal, my heart pounded with the weight of knowing that whatever was written inside had been waiting for me, waiting for this moment, waiting for the boy who had once been mocked to become the man strong enough to open it. But in the founder's office, I discovered a letter no one had ever read. His handwriting trembled, but his message was timeless. The envelope felt fragile in my hands, its paper yellowed with age, edges curled as though it had waited decades in silence for someone to open it. The seal cracked softly under my fingers, and when I pulled out the folded sheets within, I was struck first by the handwriting. It was uneven in places, the ink faint, the lines shaking slightly, as though written by a man whose hands were no longer steady, but whose heart still carried immense weight. I leaned forward beneath the dim glow of the desk lamp, my breath shallow, and began to read. The words were not businesslike or formal. They were not filled with numbers, contracts, or strategies. Instead, they read like a confession, a letter written not to shareholders or executives, but to someone he would never meet, the one who would come after him, the one he hoped would understand what so many had forgotten. He wrote of his childhood first, of the days when he, too, had pressed his face against store windows, dreaming of toys he could never afford. He spoke of carving his first wooden figure with a knife too big for his small hands, of painting it with colors borrowed from his mother's sewing kit, of the joy he felt when he saw another child smile as they played with it. "That was the moment," he wrote, "when I realized toys are not objects. They are bridges between imagination and reality, between loneliness and companionship, between who a child is and who they dream they can be." As I read, my chest tightened. His story was mine. The boy who once stood outside in longing, the boy who carved toys from scraps, the boy who dreamed even when the world called him foolish. It was as though his words had reached across time to find me. Every line felt like a mirror, reflecting my own pain, my own passion, my own unshakable belief that toys were more than playthings. The letter continued, and the tone grew heavier. He spoke of the years when his little dream became a business, when success grew faster than he could contain. At first, he had celebrated. The factories, the expansion, the wealth that poured in like water. But soon, he wrote, he saw something dangerous creeping in. Greed. The more money we made, his trembling handwriting revealed, the more I saw the joy draining from the toys. They stopped being stories and started becoming products. I watched as executives spoke not of the children's laughter, but of quarterly profits. I saw toys stripped of meaning, cheapened to meet numbers. And with each compromise, I felt a piece of my dream dying. I paused, my throat thick, my hands tightening around the letter. I could almost feel his grief, the pain of watching something he loved being devoured by people who only cared about gain. It was the same pain I had felt watching my own small efforts stolen by betrayal, watching innocence turned into exploitation. The founder admitted his failure with heartbreaking honesty. "I built something beautiful," he wrote, "and then I let others turn it into something hollow. I wanted children to hold joy, but instead too many of them held plastic shells that broke before the week was done. My dream became a machine, and I became its prisoner. The company grew, but my soul shrank." The lamplight flickered, and for a moment I had to set the letter down, pressing my palms into my eyes. His words cut into me deeper than any insult I had ever endured, because they were not just his. They were warnings, reminders that what had destroyed him could destroy me, if I was not careful. When I continued reading, his tone shifted again. Softer, almost pleading. "If you are reading this, it means the company has fallen into the wrong hands, just as I feared it might. But it also means that you, whoever you are, had the courage to bring it back. And so I beg you, do not repeat my mistake. Do not let greed erase the soul of what we build. Remember always, a toy is not measured by the profit it earns, but by the light it sparks in a child's eyes. Protect that light. Protect it at all costs." I felt my chest ache as tears blurred the words on the page. I had thought buying the company was my triumph, my redemption, my moment of revenge against the years of humiliation and poverty. But here, in my hands, was a truth so much larger than my pride. I had not simply bought a company. I had inherited a dream, a legacy born from the same struggles I had lived through, a vision that stretched far beyond me. The founder's last words struck me like a hammer to the heart. Do not forget, this company was never built for the powerful men in suits, nor for the investors who count coins. It was built for children, for their dreams, their laughter, their hope. If you ever lose sight of that, you will lose everything. I sat in silence for a long time after finishing, the weight of the letter pressing down on me as though the founder himself sat across from me, demanding an answer. My mind replayed every moment of my journey. The laughter of classmates when I sold toys in the street, the sting of humiliation in the store, the betrayal of partners who stole from me, the fire of rebuilding from scraps. I realized that every step had not been preparing me to own a company, but to understand its soul. My journey mirrored his, as if fate had chosen me not to replace him, but to carry forward what he could not finish. I folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and placed it back into the envelope. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from responsibility. For the first time, I understood that I was no longer just the boy who sold toys, or the man who had turned betrayal into resilience. I was the bearer of a legacy, the protector of a dream that had begun long before me and would outlive me if I carried it with care. The room felt different then. The heavy walls of the founder's office no longer seemed oppressive. The dust no longer seemed like decay, but like the residue of something waiting to be renewed. I looked around and felt as though the portraits on the wall, the shelves lined with forgotten prototypes, the floor that creaked with age, were all watching me, asking the same question: "Will you carry this with honor?" And in that moment, I knew the answer. This was no longer about me. It was no longer about proving myself to those who had laughed at me, or about revenge against those who had betrayed me. It was about protecting something pure, something fragile, something too important to be left in the hands of greed. And that's when I knew. This story was bigger than me. I stood before my employees and told them the truth. I was once the boy outside the glass, wart window. The auditorium was silent when I stepped onto the stage. Rows of employees filled the seats, some in crisp suits, some in uniforms still stained with the ink and paint of the factory floor. They all looked at me with a mixture of uncertainty and curiosity, the kind of gaze that comes when people are waiting to see who you truly are. I had walked into this building before as an outsider, as a child peering through windows, as a man mocked at counters. But today, I walked in as the owner, carrying not just authority but the weight of a story that had been mine long before contracts and signatures. The microphone felt heavy in my hand as I looked out at them. I could see faces that mirrored doubt, faces that carried years of disappointment under leaders who cared more for numbers than for people. I could have spoken about profits, about restructuring, about new policies and future plans. But that wasn't the story they needed to hear. That wasn't the truth that had brought me here. So I told them. "I was once the boy who stood outside one of your stores," I said, my voice trembling but steady. I pressed my face against the glass and dreamed of toys I could never afford. I was told not to touch, not to belong, not to dream. I was mocked, humiliated, and dismissed as useless. But those moments, those wounds, became the fire that carried me here. And now I stand before you not as the boy who was rejected, but as the man who owns the company that once turned him away. Gasps rippled through the room. Some shifted in their seats, stunned, others leaned forward, their eyes widening as though the pieces of a puzzle had just fallen into place. I saw workers in the back glance at one another with quiet recognition. People who had known humiliation themselves, who had walked through life unseen, who understood the ache of being dismissed. My story was not just mine anymore. It belonged to all of them. I continued, my words heavier now, yet freer than they had ever been. This company was not built to be a machine for profit. It was built to spark dreams. Toys are not plastic shells or numbers on a ledger. They are bridges, memories, companions. They carry stories, and they carry hope. And I promise you, from this day forward, that is what we will protect. We will not chase greed at the cost of meaning. We will create toys that matter, toys that remind children that their dreams are worth holding. The silence in the hall was no longer uncertain. It was reverent, charged, alive. Some employees blinked rapidly, their eyes shimmering. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking as if my words had touched something she had buried long ago. Men who had worked decades on assembly lines sat straighter, pride slowly warming their tired expressions. And then, quietly at first, but unmistakably, applause began to ripple through the room. It grew louder, stronger, until the hall was filled with clapping that was less about approval and more about recognition. They weren't clapping for me. They were clapping because they saw themselves in my story. I thought of the founder's letter, of his warning about greed, of his reminder that power means nothing without purpose. I thought of my father's words, spoken in the dim light of our kitchen, about dignity living in the heart, not in the title. And I realized that everything had come full circle. I had once been the invisible boy who sold toys on the street, mocked and ignored. Now I was the man standing in front of hundreds, not with vengeance, but with vision. I stepped away from the microphone for a moment, letting the applause fade, and then spoke again with the calm of someone who finally understood his place. I know some of you remember the old ways. I know some of you fear change. But let me tell you this. Change is not something to fear when it brings us closer to who we were always meant to be. We will be a company that listens, that respects, that remembers the child behind every purchase. Because when a child holds a toy, they are not holding plastic. They are holding a dream. And dreams are what will last long after we are gone. The words hung in the air, and I could feel them settle into the room like seeds waiting to grow. From that day forward, things began to shift. The employees carried themselves differently, not because their jobs had suddenly become easier, but because they knew they were part of something larger than profit margins. They were no longer building for shareholders they would never meet. They were building for children who would one day smile, laugh, and dream because of their hands. And as for me, I never forgot the glass window where it all began. Sometimes I returned quietly, standing outside the very store where I had once pressed my face against the glass. I would watch children running inside, their eyes glowing as they pointed at toys, their parents smiling as they chose gifts. And each time I felt tears rise, not from pain, but from gratitude. I had been on both sides of that glass, the boy locked out and the man holding the key. And I had learned that the distance between those two worlds was not as wide as it seemed. I was mocked for selling toys. I was humiliated for touching what I could not buy. I was betrayed, broken, rebuilt. But now I was the one carrying the dream forward. And that dream was never just mine. It belonged to every child who had ever believed in something bigger than themselves, every worker who had ever been overlooked, every dreamer who had ever been called foolish. I looked out at my employees once more, their faces filled with hope I had never seen before, and I ended my speech with the words that had been waiting in my heart for years. You once laughed at me. You once called me useless. But today, I tell you this: no child, no worker, no dreamer will ever be dismissed again. Because toys are not just toys. They are the seeds of dreams, and maybe— I paused, my voice catching as I met the eyes of those listening. The toy you hold today is the first step toward your dream tomorrow. This story proves that no dream is too small to change the world. From a boy selling toys on the street to owning the company that once rejected him, resilience rewrites destiny. If this journey inspired you, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Don't forget to like this video, share it with a dreamer who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that will touch your heart and fuel your courage.